Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hunting for Silver Linings. Today is Friday, February 5th, here in the Great Lakes region of the United States. I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm Corey Hart, the chapter director of Startup Grind Grand Rapids. Joined by the co-host, we have Yorgo Katsanos. He's down in Atlanta, Georgia right now on his road show. And Hunting for Silver Linings, we started this program last year around this time. To check in with ecosystem builders, innovators, and domain experts around the globe to kind of help us figure out what the hell is going on. Because from week to week, it's very, very interesting and exciting. And to that end, I'd love to introduce our guest today. We have Otto Pohl joining us. You're over in California, correct?
Yep, in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, fantastic. So grateful for the generosity of your time and joining us today. We'd love to get started with an introduction on you and maybe cover some of your background and give us the long way because it's really very interesting.
Fabulous. Well, first of all, thank you both to having me on the show today. I really appreciate it. It's fun and to sort of be part of the community and to chat with you. So I'll give you I'll give you a slightly longer sort of version into my history. So I graduated with a degree in government back in the day, and I did my senior thesis on the Cold War, and so obviously the Soviet Union and the United States were going to blow each other up. That when it didn't happen, the Soviet Union just sort of collapsed. I decided, well, I had to go over and check it out. So I moved over to Russia in the early 90s, and I became a photojournalist because that was, I thought, was the best way for being a curious person to get paid for curiosity. And so I was there as a photojournalist. I became the New York Times bureau photographer, traveled all over the former Soviet Union, and then also the 90s, I saw various opportunities and co-founded a couple of businesses over there, which was awesome. The photo related at the time because that's what I knew, like Russia's first professional photo lab and the like, together with Kodak back when they were still funding things and ultimately buying things. They bought that business. And so I had this sort of curiosity. I started writing then as a journalist. I then later moved back to journalism. I did wrote for a bunch of newspapers and magazines. And so I really saw the sort of, and I think it's a great place to start, by the way, sort of paid curiosity. If I highly recommend it to everybody. But what also gave me for my later career was that first step into obviously understanding how the media landscape works, what an editor thinks about, what a writer thinks about, what the sort of their motivations are, how stories work and the like. So I really kind of saw it from that side. And then obviously as the entrepreneurship side over my career, I've co-founded 4 different companies. And so I've really deeply experienced that sort of journey and the highs and the lows and the uncertainties and the unknowns and everything that sort of comes together when you're a founder. And so later I decided to combine those two. And I realized, hey, if I've got this sort of storytelling side and I know the entrepreneurship side, storytelling and brand building and PR building and sort of that communications outreach is such an important part of anybody's startup journey. Why can't I combine the two? Because I also I've seen it from both sides. And that's when I became head of communications for a number of startups, which I greatly enjoyed. But now I'm doing it as a consultant, which is in many ways the best of both worlds, because now I get to work with sort of a larger group of companies and sort of pick and choose what I want to work on. But again, still drawing on the past of those two experiences are the sort of 2 broad pillars of experience are what makes me sort of do the job I do today.
And you're plugged in with some organizations that really focus on some early stage founders and companies, and to the high level of work that you do and provide for these companies that are in these programs, accelerators, incubators, whatever other programs. It's not my experience to often see such strong focus on the work that you do. A lot of times companies and founders aren't thinking about the stuff that you cover until much later, right? Can you talk about some of these programs that you're working with and maybe why they've identified what others maybe haven't, as far as like this being a critical point of getting started?
Yeah, well, so the first incubator that I went through the Stanford StartX incubator with one of the companies that I had, and that's sort of where I was sort of introduced to that world of accelerators and incubators and the like. And And you're absolutely right. Like a lot of I mean, listen, when you're a founder, there's like there's a list that's infinitely long about all the stuff you need to do, and there's like always more. Everything's critical, right? Like everything has to happen. Like, oh my gosh, this is super important. Storytelling, PR, and general communications is often something that sort of falls by the wayside because it sort of feels like, oh, it's like a nice to have. Like later, I'll need to build the buzz, but first I need to build the company, that kind of thing. And so it often gets a little bit, it gets sort of a little bit pushed down the list. But what I find is so important is that oftentimes, especially in those early stages, is defining the story is a strategic function. And it almost helps you define, it forces you to think about and define who are those customers you're going after? Are there different segments for them? What is it that they need to hear? What do our investors need to hear? And then as you start to tell and refine and iterate on that story, you almost start to get a good sense of, or it can certainly then inform like, well, the strategy that you might want to pursue. So it's not just sort of a bolt on later, but it becomes sort of an integral part of the strategic process early on in a company. And so some of those groups have been is great and so realize they need to focus on it. But I must say I found a pretty big niche because I find that a lot of people sort of don't worry about it. It feels like something you can sort of put off till later. But it always, I mean, I guess like so many things in the entrepreneurial process, but it's definitely something that can yield real value if you sort of tackle it head on early on.
Right. And we see that, a lot of communications organizations don't even like to get into the game that early because, well, there's not a lot of big checks to be like asked for a build. Like you really can't be billing like a ton, right? For most of the people that are in those early stages because they haven't raised yet, or, they're not independently wealthy. They don't have a pile of customers. But so this is clearly you have an interest and passion for this stage of founder, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there's obviously the PR world is massive, right? Like, but it's been very agency driven, and the agencies, they tend to be these sort of larger companies for, if you're the, founder, who spends, 30 hours a day just thinking about, your own startup. For them, you're just sort of a client. They are obviously going to be somewhat reactive. And so they sort of tend to wait for, oh, well, when you have a product announcement, or, oh, when you're going to, announce your funding round, or like you got a new board member, or whatever the acquisition. That's when they'll sort of spring into action and they'll sort of deliver something, but it's kind of reactive. And so much of the value gets added when you have to really be more proactive in your thinking, and sort of really sort of help and dive in and almost sort of realize the opportunities that there are there before you as a founder can even necessarily verbalize them. And so I find that, it's like you have to be sort of extra thoughtful and again proactive about how you're going to sort of approach the storytelling of that company, and that's just not well suited to the mindset of an agency, which at the end of the day, like their business model is all around, well, how many clients can I get and sort of charge monthly fees for, and how little work can I do in order to keep them all at least acceptably happy.
And martinis are very expensive, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they can, and you go with the established companies, they'll charge an arm and a leg. So it's, anyways, and I think that, so part of the problem is that they that also if you haven't been a founder, then they don't quite share that same understanding and sort of this understanding of who you are. They love the big fat companies that just are, oh, sure, like a $20,000 monthly retainer, and we'll put out a couple of press releases, and we'll call it good. And that's just not the mindset that a founder needs.
And it seems like you're also involved at a point where you're probably doing a lot of coaching for these founders as well, and you're also watching these early stage companies maybe even find who their customers are, because some people start with a solution and not so much a customer. Is that, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and maybe through the lens of one of the areas that I found to be most where I've sort of been valued the most, or that also enjoy the most, which are when you have there's deep tech and fintech and sort of science and health tech and space tech, and there are these founders who spend their entire day thinking about things that are like way over my head, right? And they're neck deep in math and science, and they're thinking all day about this solution, and they're often very solution centric, because that's sort of the nature of being a scientist, is just figure. And so two things. One is that the nature of science is obviously to be sort of deep in just like solving the problem, not necessarily like the marketing side that feels like, you're almost like a selling out type thing. And so they are trying to work through those things, and they don't really have room for thinking about what it is that they are going to, how they're going to explain that sort of to the outside world. And so I find that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to sort of help them figure out how to tell that story in a way that actually makes it more accessible. And then, of course, the upside for them is that obviously, if you have that, that it ultimately it helps them explain it to everyone else that's out there. And so oftentimes that value happens at sort of those earliest stages, because then they realize, oh, wait a minute, like once we start thinking about it in this way, there is a certain market or a certain customer type that would actually be most interested in that solution, but they might have like a certain need for an aspect of the business I do, or they need one other add-on to this to the solution I provide, and not so much on some other part that I've been working on. And so it often helps sort of define the product more narrowly once you've defined who the audience is, because then you realize that, sure, the heart of the solution might still be the value that you're offering, but certain pieces might fall away, other pieces might need to be added in. So helping founders who are thinking about those kind of the big issues out there, sort of hone in on their customer demographic and on their problems, allows them to then also sort of fine tune the product that they're offering. And those are the types of things where that storytelling and that sort of iterative process of figuring out who you are and the products that and how you're going to reach those customers can really impact the product that you're creating, right? And those are the types of services that a PR agency or something, I mean, that's like way beyond what they're thinking about.
And Yorgo, I have one last thing that I'm going to ask Otto here before I let you at him on this path. So you brought up that you have these real technical founders, and they're solving some amazing problems that we've never even thought that were even problems. We're like, wow, that's cool. Now these early stage folks, like they like when you're presenting with the idea of like clarity, right? You're talking about honing in and clarifying message. You're right. These people in the early stages don't really think that has the tremendous value, because they're busy building 50 slide presentations, trying to get like every bit of information out there, right? Jam it through the little hole of communication. This like, do you have like a framework that you like massage these founders, like you pound them? Is it brutal? Is it like what's the secret sauce on how you help these confused, like just so energetic, excited founders find that clarity of message?
There's no kind of, I mean, one thing is like, no, there's no simple framework, but there's simple questions you can ask, right? Like, I mean, in a way, it's like, explain this to me like I'm a 3-year-old, right? Like, it's like, tell me, like, help me, almost those dumb, simple questions can trigger almost a catharsis where they realize that, like, oh, wait a minute, like, I've been, operating up here, and I just need to like make it really simple. And so almost like coming at it like an intelligent, I would say an intelligent toddler, but like, right, it's like coming at it as an intelligent, like sort of tabula rasa, and just saying, hey, help me understand this in, the simplest possible terms. And I think also oftentimes asking questions when someone gives you a buzzword filled answer or something that sounds very intelligent, but you didn't really understand it, is just asking them that follow-up question, like, wait a minute, just clarify this for me one more time. And as you like sort of iteratively ask, and it's sort of an honestly curious, but you sort of intelligent and yet sort of simple way, oftentimes that story starts to come out. And so then it's a matter of, I mean, ultimately the successful story, depending on if it's a fundraising deck you're building or a website you're building or whatever it might be. Obviously the goals are different for the output that you're going to create, but in a way the process of getting there is more driven by sort of general guidelines than it is by anything specific, because at the end of the day, you are going to, every story is unique. The state of every company and who their founders are and what their client's situation is and their funding situation, all those different inputs. It's a little bit like the snowflake, right? Like the small different inputs from the outside world end up creating, kind of different things. I often think it's a little bit like house construction, right? Like we all have like sort of basic fundamental, right? There's needs, got to have a kitchen, got to have a bedroom, got to have the bathroom, right? But like, it's amazing like how even slight differences in maybe the topography of the land around that property or where the weather patterns, obviously, or how they want to use it, or these small sort of differences in those outside parameters in the hands of an architect, like almost inevitably yields like a completely different house. And they all share the same kind of fundamental sort of usability characteristics, and they all hopefully get the job done and they stay standing and provide, so good life for the inhabitants. But they look really different, right, on the outside. And in a way, that's what same thing with every company. So you can't, you don't want to sort of mass produce them like a row house, because that never really serves everyone's needs. You want to end up with something that, again, sort of expresses the needs of the occupants most effectively, and serves those basic needs, but does it in a style and an approach that sort of maximizes everyone's sort of happiness with the project.
Now, we had a good opportunity to speak with you a little while ago before this conversation today. So I'm sure that Yorgo is coming prepared with a couple of questions for you.
Well, it is fascinating to see a practitioner that started at the cutting edge of frontline journalism in an emerging market that experienced not only volatility, but significant and prolonged dislocation, through essentially bootstrapping and being innovative in his own right. And at the same time, you have gone at the very other end of the spectrum, which is equally highly volatile, equally anchored on bootstrapping, but has to do with high tech. So essentially, you have moved from an intellectual geographical emerging market to an intellectual technological emerging market. So based on this observation, I'm sure you must be taking steps back occasionally, and you must be thinking, okay, well, what is innovation? Point one. Point two, is this a concept of design thinking and oversimplification, or does it really have roots anchored on define where you want to be? Because if you can't, you may end up elsewhere, and that elsewhere may be painful. And number three, clearly you've been doing that for some time, Otto. Do you see any differences between the previous iterations? And I'm delighted you mentioned the word iteration, because at the end of the day, excellence, success, and startups are about successful iteration, really.
Right.
So I've asked three questions that are interrelated, but have also touched upon your intellectual pedigree, if you don't mind my saying, in the sense that before and while you're extending an arm of help and consulting and advice to these young entrepreneurs, you must be asking, has the zoo changed? And who is who in this particular zoo today?
Right. Wow. Well, that's, first of all, a lot of that was a whole set of questions, and I like the comparison and the analysis, but sort of early '90s Russia and kind of sort of the tech market today, and I'll see if I can remember the, sort of the various questions you asked and sort of get to them. It's a great set of questions. But let me start with maybe a set of a more simpler kind of response, which is that when I went to Moscow in the early '90s, so much of it is it's driven by like, hey, there's something cool happening over here. I should probably be in the middle of it, and not necessarily even thinking about it to some like intellectual, well, if I do this, that'll help my career in the following ways, and blah, blah. Like you just sort of get like, this, like, that is like a wave I'd like to ride, and sort of almost sort of going with, I guess, it sounds fun. It sounds interesting. It sounds awesome. I'd like to go be part of that. And I think that giving yourself that permission and just going to do it, it sounds like this big act of bravery, but it's really not. It's just, maybe getting past like a few sort of simple hangups that, well, that sounds so far away. Like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to live? You get so, you can get so tangled up in what's going to sort of happen and the potential downsides, that I think that what seems like in many ways should be a very sort of natural thing. Like, oh, that sounds fun. Like, that sounds interesting. That sounds like ultimately like I'm putting myself where there's going to be a universe that has better options in it than if I stay on my sort of current path. It is something good to do. And I think that, I guess that's sort of at the heart of every entrepreneur's journey, is like that sort of realization, like you sort of see what could be as opposed to see what is, and you sort of see what's missing as opposed to like just focusing on what there is. And so I think that maybe the kind of the lightness of heart that allowed me to go to Moscow in the early 90s is also something that I've enjoyed sort of following in the rest of my life. So there's a fine line between overanalysis, sort of design thinking, and like, where is this going to scenario planning, and like, where is this going to go, which can be very powerful, but can also be in a way inhibiting because it sort of encourages sort of analysis paralysis, versus just like on some level going with the flow, and you can sort of see where, we can also broadly see where things are going. And in the early 90s, there really wasn't arguably any place more fascinating on the planet than Moscow and the former Soviet Union. It was just where the action was, an eighth of the world's Earth's surface or whatever it is, suddenly having sort of collapsed and going through this like sort of massive upheaval. Why wouldn't you want to be there? And so in a way there is that parallel between that and entrepreneurship. And so maybe those two things sort of were connected. I forget I remember you asked about design thinking, and design.
Especially, just let me interrupt you for a second.
Yep.
Very often we find that investors and indeed young entrepreneurs don't have an understanding of quote unquote exit. In other words, although they have started, they've done the bootstrapping, they've done Series A, Series B, and so on and so forth, and they hang on in there for dear life, and they're missing the point that at some point you have to exit. And of course, you can qualify what this exit may look like, but you can't be riding the same kind of horse forever. This process of iteration has a natural conclusion and or maturity. Does it?
Well, it does. Exits, that's a really interesting one, right? And generally, I review a lot of early stage pitch decks, and there's like the exit slide and how they're going to sell for billions of dollars and all that. And my instinct is almost inevitably to take that stuff out. And I know that the answer you're always supposed to give when you're building a company, or what's your exit strategy? Like, I don't have one, because you're trying to show that you're so committed, you're not even thinking about that. You are doing this out of a sense of passion. You almost can't see beyond it. And generally, I think that that's the right approach. I think that it's very easy in the entrepreneurial journey, particularly in tech, which has that sort of vision of like, everything's supposed to be scalable, right? Like if you're starting a dog grooming business, like you don't think of the egg, you're like, wow, like I could make like $1,000 a week, like grooming dogs. And then you think like, maybe I get to $2,000 and that'll be great. Like, but you don't enter the dog grooming business with that sort of idea of like scalability and exit, right? You think of like providing for a life, and then you sort of see where that goes. And tech has that, at least holds forth that vision of like, if I can do this for 10 people, I can do this for 10 million people, and then it'll be worth billions, and Mark Zuckerberg and whatever. And it while that's an obvious attraction for any, and I highly encourage like scalable businesses, obviously that's great. I think that there's also it's also easy to get ahead of yourself, where you can then sort of say, oh well, if I can do 10, then I'm next thing is going to be 10 million. And there's actually a lot of hard work between 10 and 10 million. And if you start thinking about the 3 steps, you can just, you got to keep your eye on the ball, and the ball is at 10, right? And you got to get to 20 before you can get further than that. And so it's a fine line between managing that thought between so keeping an eye on the big vision so you know which way you need to sail the boat, and also like in a way not letting yourself get distracted out of it because you're still right here and you need to direct that boat 10 feet in front of you first before anything else happens. Otherwise, it's all going off the rails. To mix.
You're mentioning a point which is very interesting, that essentially you expect the captain of the ship to be able to have both a strategic long-term perspective, but also to micromanage or at least follow the compass and trim the sails accordingly. You remember the old saying that behind a great man is always a greater woman. In terms of companies, we have seen that whenever you have duets, like for instance in Berkshire, like for instance in Amazon, in Facebook, and it goes on and on, Google and so on, whereas one person is playing the COO, the daily volatility manager, and the other is the longer term thinker. Do you see this model as being more appropriate, and at what stage? And related to this, do you consider the fact that innovators sometimes can be an impediment, something that you feel compelled to present and or discuss?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that it has to, unfortunately, like so many great things in the world, has to be a balance, right? Like you have to figure out how to do both. And in some cases, you can have that split by role. Like here's the kind of visionary, CEO guy holding the TED Talks, and over here is the person who actually gets it all done today and make sure that the toilets are clean. And obviously in a founding situation, you're going to have to do both, right? You're going to have to be. I mean, and I think that most founders come at it. Understand, I mean, they're attracted by the long-term vision. Wow, like, I could redefine healthcare. And on the other hand, like, yeah, but like today, like I need to raise, my seed round. And you're going to have to sort of, keep that balance. And if you can find, early on that you can sort of divide that, then that's great. But ultimately, I think probably everybody on the founding team and probably throughout is going to have to sort of manage that one internally. And there's probably I don't know, it's probably one of those 80-20 things, right? Like it's like 20% of your time is just spent on like the big vision, which is helps you first of all sort of realize why you're doing all this, because the day-to-day can grind you down pretty quickly, and you sort of lose track of why am I doing this again? And so you need to sort of it's sort of for motivation, but B, then it's also like it then says, well, which of the toilets do I need to clean today in order to like keep myself heading in that general direction of the big vision? Because otherwise, like I said earlier, when everything seems so super important, it helps maybe prioritize the stuff that you need to do today. And so I think that, so that's why you mentioned design thinking earlier, and I want to touch on that. Which is more of a sort of a bottom-up approach, right? So we had this sort of first idea of like the big, as some people call it, the big hairy, the BHAG, the big hairy audacious goal, right? You got that sort of big North Star vision, and then like which way am I going to sail the ship? So that's that sort of 80-20 rule. And then and another way is sort of design thinking, right? Which sort of came out of Stanford. They're sort of one of the big sort of proponents of it, and it's in a way it sort of almost gets back to a simpler, more naive, but it's a simpler version of figuring out that long goal, which is to ask, as I was mentioning earlier, those like simple questions. Like it's like going to the customer and saying like, well, what do you really need? Like, tell me more. And so you just sort of go as sort of an honest, open, curious person to actually ask the customer. It sounds revolutionary, right? Like to actually ask them like what it is they need and what are their pain points and what are their blockers. And it could often help you like realize what it is that the service you need to offer is. And that can inform both the long-term vision of where I need to go, because now I've really got a clear sense of what the customer needs, but also it can start to say like, okay, but the very first product I could offer, like what they really need is they need, this. I remember one of the famous examples was sort of keeping neonates swarm in emerging markets, right? Like, so like you have all these like preemies and the like being born in wherever, and you got to keep them warm, but they don't have access to regular electricity. And it was one of these sort of examiners design thinking things. And ultimately they boiled it down to what they really need is like sort of a redesigned sleeping bag, effectively, that they could put around the sort of the neonatal sort of crib or whatever. And so it can not only inform the larger vision of like, wow, here's this massive market, and I really understand it, down to like the simple, wait a minute, there's a $10 solution that at least gets us going, and that's what I should be focusing on today. And so that's where I think that design thinking process can be really valuable for helping both sides of that, sort of that visioning and sort of prioritization process.
Thank you, Otto. I mean, this is a very valuable summary of your experience, I think, and this is something that we are beginning to decipher across the board a little bit, the 80-20, the heuristics that are emerging after many years of developing companies. But let me ask you, again, a broader question for a moment. You've been doing that for some time. Do you see a difference in the quality of leadership that is creating the next generation of companies? Do you see a quality change in terms of social, environmental, compliance issues, corporate governance issues, and equity, of course? Because in the older days, we remember we had the CEO or the founder, the innovator, whatever was the big honcho, the big elephant in the room, and everybody else was more or less there at his or her grace. Have we seen any qualitative change?
I mean, that's quite a great question. In a way, it's obviously bigger than me, right? Like I have no, I don't pretend to like have sort of like my pulse on the overall sort of corpus of entrepreneurs out there. What I can say though is that the process of innovation and the process of building a company, the amount to which it's been widgetized and processized has been incredible. Like I always think back to in the late 90s, I was working at a startup in San Francisco, right? So it's sort of the first internet boom. I was doing business development for a sort of online photo company. And like a third of the company were like a bunch of people in the back room maintaining the servers that were sort of like putting up the website of this company. And it was like, this amazingly complex process that if they wanted to put together a service where you could, register your film or get it scanned, right? Or the services that they were doing, just getting that service up and running was a remarkable achievement. And that's obviously been totally taken away by, Amazon Web Services and like, but those innovations have been, across the board made to sort of been standardized and simplified. Everything from like this, I was just talking to an entrepreneur who's about to close a note round, like these sort of standard funding procedures have been sort of put into place. And obviously, you look at all that sort of online HR solutions. I mean, now within the space of a day, you can set up your entire like accounts receivable, accounts payable, your legal side, your obviously your investing, your cap table, right? That's all sort of been, all of these things used to be really hard and used to take all this sort of almost domain expertise to figure out, or you had to hire people to do it. Now you can do it all, in the space of a week. You can have a remarkably sort of complex system set up. So I don't know whether the quality has sort of necessarily gotten better, but it empowers those that are really good among us and that are sort of dedicated to be able to move faster and create more value more quickly. And so I think that those tools, even 20 out feels like, the hairy ancient past, right? The sort of first internet boom, but that's really only 20 years ago. And the amount of tools that are there. And obviously also like in a way, the mindset, right? Like the mindset of, you said that, yeah, it used to be very vertical and hierarchical, and there's sort of this sort of stodgy thinking. And now of course there's a lot more sort of creativity. We've seen what works, and it allows people to move more flexibly, more quickly. And it's really like, that's just for an entrepreneur. It's just, it's been an amazing shift in the last.
Yeah, of course, and I think that what you're mentioning is absolutely correct in the sense that we have broken down the components of, on the one hand, the innovation itself as a process, and on the other hand, creating a company around an innovative concept. Now, the key question, as far as we are concerned sometimes, because we see these proliferation of accelerators and incubators and everything else in between, is it correct to push companies to go through the learning curve rapidly? Is there perhaps something to be said about gradual evolution of a company through organic growth in the old style, as opposed to simply pushing till the outcome, instead of 7 to 8 years, is now 3 years, 4 years maximum? And because, of course, if you start accelerating this process, there's going to be a lot of opposition, attrition, and at the same time, the outcome may not be optimal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like, the horse racing business. Like they keep pushing the thoroughbreds to race younger and younger, right? Because they can get, but it's obviously a greater risk to the horse, and a lot of them are sort of broken legged or retired by 3. But yes, I mean, for entrepreneurs, I mean, it's very easy. Again, I mean, that speeding up process is a double-edged sword on some level, because it makes it seem like, oh, like anyone can do this and we should do this quickly. And if we can do it in a month, why can't we do it in a week? And it does sort of encourage a certain amount of corner cutting and again, sort of getting ahead of yourself, right? Like that's always the important thing with every entrepreneur is, and that kind of gets back to that sort of, how do I balance my sort of day-to-day schedule in terms of long-term visioning, which is versus like getting the stuff done I need to do today. Is that it can sort of make it seem like it sort of encourage you to almost think past where you should be thinking today. And I think that that can be that can be a risk, like that, you can just sort of throw money at the problem and you can solve it. But like at the end of the day, like it still requires sort of true insight, and insight can happen quickly. I mean, there's no shortage of examples of we can all list the companies that, sort of became unicorns in their first year. But the fact of the matter is that actually usually sort of true insight and true value creation, there's a 10-year history before that point. And so it can be a sort of a false promise that a lot of the speed servicing can hold.
Well, we have covered innovation. We have covered the process of incubation, if you want. Now let's turn the perspective, and instead of looking at the entrepreneur, you must have had quite several discussions with investors. What do you see as, on the one hand, being the driving force? And again, you can quantify. You want to talk about angel investors, you may want to talk about VCs, you may want to talk about late stage, whatever you choose. But what changes do you see from the investor's perspective? What are they looking for?
Well, I mean, on some level, obviously, it probably hasn't, changed at all. I mean, what they're looking for, I don't think that, I mean, at the end of the day, right, you're always trying to get, you're always trying to identify the sort of future value and sort of buy it cheap, right? And it's and I mean, I've usually been on this, obviously, both in my own companies as well as advising startups. I've usually been on the side of the people sort of like trying to sort of talk to the VCs. So there's no shortage of stories about, trying to, sort of getting frustrated about how, maybe how they're thinking about it, right? I mean, the sort of the classic, sort of rejections. Oh, I'd like to see more traction before I'll invest, right? And, to which it's like, yeah, I'd like to see the outcome of the football game before I bet on it, right? Like who wouldn't, right? But like, that's why I'm offering it to you at a discount. And so I don't know if there's that much difference between what they're looking for now, except that there's also that expectation of speed, a greater amount of data, a greater amount of access. I mean, it's just, everything's just sort of been sped up, right? Like, it's like much more like the dating scene of New York City, right? Everyone is like out there being single, looking over the shoulder. Maybe I could upgrade maybe I should swipe right, or like forget that person. I'm going like, it's just, it's made it can be quite exhausting, I guess. Like when you're sort of in that world, and certainly for the most active investors, it has, in a way, it's the increase of power that all these tools out there give people. All it really does is just like speed up the game. And so there's a component of zero sum game maybe to all of this, right? And so it's made the life easier for investors on some level, but on the other hand, it's just made it that much more 24. All these tools that we have around us, like the selling point of every single one of them is always, this is going to save you time and make it easier. I've had so much time saved with all the devices I bought. I should be like, working 3 minutes a day. And instead I feel like, I'm, working 24/7, right? Like, how'd that work? And I think on some level that's the case on both sides, for the entrepreneur as well as for the investor.
Now, we've talked about how things have accelerated in the fact of tools available to us, right? So yeah, I can set up my HR in an hour and for free, right? I can set up a supply chain in a week versus like months. But then also that's coupled with this last year where we've seen trends accelerate. So trends have been trends, but now we've seen those accelerated some 10 years, 50 years in the energy sector, some places, like generational like advances in trends just in the last year. So when you're working with so many startups and founders, and they're entering like 2020, like March, April, and then all of a sudden things like time compresses, right? I'm interested to learn about how you handled that on behalf of and for founders and startups when even like the idea of like customers might have like what we thought was our customer like in April of 2020, all of a sudden, nope, we don't know that they're totally someplace else now, because like there are no more dogs coming into my shop or whatever, I maybe you understand what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, I do. And the interesting thing is that the hardest part of this whole pandemic has not been that like, oh, the world is different now, because we get it. Like, we're all on Zoom or whatever. Like, we're not taking the dog to the groomer. We're like, things have changed. We're not going out for drinks. Like, that's easy. The hard part is when knowing like what's going to stick, right? Like, what's not going to go back. So that's like the total unknown. Like, I was looking at a pitch deck of a company that's, it's like a shared workspace, right? And they offer a whole bunch of suite of services for founders and entrepreneurs and all that. And well, what of those services like are needed now? Like, should you be like signing every lease in sight because right now you could buy them cheap, and in a year when everybody's going to be back in these shared workspaces, you'll be raking it in with all these like long-term leases you locked in cheap. Or we are going to be like, well, hey, it all kind of works from home. Like, I can do it. Like, you should be doubling down on these virtual services because that's where everyone's going to stay. And so the hard part was not realizing that, realizing that the world changed, and which obviously brings with its own disruptions, but is trying to figure out how humanity is going to respond to taking off the mask.
Right. And when you have to be so agile with your communication strategy, because of that uncertainty, what has been your advice, or what has been the practice this last year?
So, well, two things. One, for just sort of take that example of the shared workspace. Like, in a way, like, that's beyond my, in a way, fortunately, like, that's not my problem, like, on some level, because that's why, they're going to get paid the big bucks for figuring it out and getting it right. Like, they're the owner of the business. But the most, from a communications perspective, you try to just, sort of lean into those things that everyone else is trying to figure out. So what can we share today that is going to allow some other people to gain wisdom from the experience that founders, for example, is going through. So it sort of brings me to one of my core suggestions that I always have for people trying to build buzz around a company, right? Like, in a way, the goal of a founder and the goal of a startup is always to look and act bigger than it is, right? Like, until you are that big person, right? You basically have to sort of be the role in order to become the person. And one of the ways, this classic ways of doing that, is sort of what I think of as sort of the jujitsu, which is you sort of lean into an existing trend and sort of turn that power. So if everyone is curious about like what's going to happen with office space, after the pandemic ends, well, come up with some kind, and then you can talk about the specifics, but like come up with some kind of an answer to that, or a thought to that, or a way to look at that question, or a way to analyze that question, some data set other people hadn't thought about, and present that. And that becomes something that other people are going to want to read because they're all thinking about the same thing. And now you can suddenly propel your own startup to the sort of thought leadership level within that community, and you can start becoming the person that people are going to come to. So in a way, it's as the communications expert, my job is more to like put you at the forefront. I can't figure out your business answer necessarily. That's not my job, is to figure out your ultimately your allocations of business resources. But what I can say is like, hey, here's this thing that's going on. Here's a way that you can inject yourself into the situation and to reach the types of people that you want to sort of get in front of. And this is how we can sort of raise the profile of that business. Often it is by just, discussing those same issues that are on everybody's mind. And that's ultimately why they're going to end up reading an article about you.
Sure. Now, related to the topic of like things being accelerated, there's something that can't be accelerated in my opinion, and that would be experience and perspective. And then with you yourself having thrown yourself and lurched into a different culture, years and years ago with just dropping into Moscow. And you've used this word, I can't even count how many times, curiosity. So now that we're entering, we've lurched last year. Now we're in another lurch, but maybe culturally, and this is global, not just the United States. Are there some pointers on how founders and businesses can stay relevant with maybe trying to advance their cultural intelligence? I don't know what that is.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think you're exactly right. Like, in terms of that, there are some things that you can't speed up. You have to have been through a couple of business cycles and through a couple of sort of cultural cycles. And then you start to see the patterns, and just reading about them in a history book never has that same visceral feeling that you do by living through it. You start to see, oh yeah, here we go, like with another, real estate bubble or stock market bubble or whatever it is. And this too will sort of find its level. I agree. I mean, there's some people incredibly impressive, like, people who've founded and sold, 3 multi-$100-million companies by the age of 25 and or whatever. I mean, obviously they have some incredible experience, and, anybody, would be dumb to discount that and the knowledge that they bring. At the same time, there is something by, they've all maybe done all of those businesses within the same business cycle. Like the last 8 years have been basically, there's been this really interesting, obviously so upward sort of trend, and certainly incredible liquidity in the capital markets, which is often, not sort of matched by the sort of the underlying business cycle. And so they've done all that within that one, and there's a real value that comes from having that longer perspective. Maybe that's just, me trying to justify, value of my middle age, but I really do think that it's true, that having seen things in different business cycles is, it sort of starts to, you start to feel the patterns that you can read about in a book, but it's still different. And then the other, what I would say, is also the cultural difference, or like when I went to Moscow, like I very quickly sort of had this, the Russians think this way and they act this way and they do this way, and we do it all differently in the States. And And sort of over time, you realize that when you see a bunch of different cultures, you start to see the similarities and the difference, and some differences, but more similarities than anything else. That too, I think, is incredibly valuable. And I think that, I mean, if I had to give advice to any young person, it's like the first thing I would do after college is like kick them out to the furthest country that they can find and go figure it out there. Getting yourself out of that comfort zone is incredibly educational, and sort of yields insights that I think provide kind of a good frame of reference for everything that comes later.
Sure. Well, we're kind of at the end here. Wondering if you have any thoughts or ideas that might have been bubbling up this last hour that we spent together that you have as far as guidance for our flock of entrepreneurs in the startup grind community. And then also, I want you to be able to tell people how to find you.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that I sort of use the word curiosity a lot, and I really can't overuse that word enough. I mean, I think that having a sort of that on the sort of maintaining that sort of that simple curiosity. It's amazing how far you get, not only learning about your own customer, it's getting to learn about these sort of mentors or investors, right? You don't approach people like a sell, you approach them just like, honestly, like, how did you do it? Like, where'd you get? Wow, that's impressive. Tell me more. Like, if you actually give it, if you actually care about like what they, who they are and what they did and how they got to where they're going, people love to talk about themselves. Like, look at me, right? Like, it's an hour here talking about myself. I mean, everybody likes to be sort of honestly sort of asked. And in many times that's really good, sort of, just general sort of good social advice, like be honestly sort of curious. But for business things, it can yield unbelievable insights as well for who your customers are, or what your investors want, or what your employees are really asking for. And I think that it can get, again, when you sort of start thinking about this, it gets back to the conversation earlier about all the systems that have been, the efficiencies that have been put in place. It can sometimes distract us from some of the sort of the simple old classic sort of rules to live by. And for me, the one that is sort of yielded the most is that element of curiosity. And so, yes, to find me, so I have a communications consultancy. It's Core Communications with the ever short corecommunicationsconsulting.com. I'm also obviously on LinkedIn and anywhere else. And you can, I don't know if you're post an email address or whatever, but I obviously be happy to chat with anybody. I'm always interested in hearing what other people thought of this, or have a question, or they wanted. Doors always open.
And who are the kinds of people that you're excited about meeting currently? Like if your email inbox was to be flooded, what are the emails that you're excited to open?
So I'm most excited. I mean, so I've been focusing on fintechs, health techs, and so deep science tech. So in a way, the ones that are harder to explain, like I do less of consumer goods, like someone who's has a new lipstick or something that they want to sell, or a new drink that they're trying to market. And that's sort of beyond, in a way, those always feel like there's a certain kind of souffle aspect. Like some of them like blow up beautifully and other ones don't. And what's the difference? Maybe it's because some star was seen drinking it on the red carpet. Those are those types of things that I have massive respect for, people pulling off. But maybe I over intellectualized like the process more. I'm like, why is this drink really that different from the other drink? And so it yields less in a way to sort of like that sort of process and explanation part. So someone who comes and tells me that they figured out a new way of sort of analyzing tissue cultures and cancer cell sort of analyses. I'm like, but you got to explain that to the right people. I'm like, I get it. So I always love that. And the more of those, the better.
Cool. And are you like region specific? You'd prefer to hear from people in the US, or you're global?
I certainly have. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm so more U.S. obviously sort of savvy in terms of also like sort of storytelling and media outlets and how the systems work. Obviously, a lot of the stuff is global. I've done a fair bit of advising people from Europe and in Eastern Europe in terms of sort of how to present themselves, because again, a lot of things are pretty standard and universal. But obviously, I have it's sort of in terms of the mechanics of executing. Obviously, I have a sort of a U.S. Centric sort of understanding of how the world works and how the media landscape looks.
Well, I want to give Yorgo the last the opportunity here to summarize or give a final thought, and then I know since the two of you have some similar some common ground that you guys have walked both during the same time in Moscow, give him the opportunity to say a fair farewell and thank you.
Well, while we were preparing for this interview, Otto, I've been thinking a lot about volatility and how the emerging markets are everywhere, in the sense that every innovator is exposed to not only a vision, a mission, a value proposition, but at the same time, the need to have the tools, especially when it comes to human capital. And in emerging markets, over the years, we've seen a tremendous transformation in terms of human capital. Sometimes this transformation has led to social unrest. And we're seeing this kind of social unrest here in the US in terms of the Twitters of this world and the Facebooks of this world, the idea of freedom of speech being challenged in certain ways, and so on and so forth. Big picture, what do you see, where would you see the next step in online communications?
Boy, I wish I knew. I will say this. I mean, I think that there's we're entering. I mean, there's a lot of risk right now. Just if you're talking about it from a sort of a systemic level, I think that the sort of media sphere, it's undergoing the exact same sort of analogous process of global warming that the environment is, right? It's the same thing where there's a general sort of heating up, but what it does in the natural world is it obviously can cause a sort of a cold snap as quite much as it can cause like sort of a heat wave or rain and sort of parched. Right? The system just sort of oscillates more wildly, and that's what we're seeing, I think, in the media landscape as well, where you have these sort of deluges that sort of blow up in certain kinds of communities. And we don't really, whereas in the old days, things were like it was just calm and slower. There was more buffer built into the system. And now it's sort of gotten really sort of just whipsaws. And so, so I, speaking as a citizen, that obviously, sort of concerns me, and I don't really, I mean, it's a longer question about knowing what the right answer is in terms of counteracting that. For an entrepreneur, it makes more opportunity, like in a way there's more opportunity, like suddenly TikTok blows up, right? Like suddenly if you get on early on this wave, and right now we should all be, what was the Clubhouse, right? Suddenly like there's probably like this great opportunity, like you could probably blow up your brand on, Clubhouse if you do it right and you get in early. And so there's these waves that you can ride that can create incredible amounts of value for yourself more quickly. So there's definitely opportunity.
These waves are iterations of the original idea, communities. And again, let me put a different perspective into the question. We have trained ourselves as consumers to sacrifice our privacy for the ease of access, ease of use.
Right.
And essentially, we are now hostages.
Yeah, I was just reading an article this morning about how they tracked everyone at the White House, right? Because they could just track all their cell phone stuff, and they could obviously match that down to the actual person. And so, yeah, I mean, we're sort of constantly, right? It's like the sweet poison of like every single device and service that we're given. And historically, we've been very willing, like, well, I have nothing to hide, right? And so, like, sure, like I'll trade all this stuff in, and the noose is sort of ever tightening. So it's but on the other hand, right? There's like I'm as worried when you start talking about if you were to have like sort of absolute privacy and you were unable to sort of see what was going on in any of this. Let's say it was, I don't know whether that's necessarily better. I remember there just now with the GameStop thing, right? Everybody was saying, oh, on the one hand, isn't it horrible that they can sort of control the game? Suddenly they were able to cut off Robinhood, so the common folk could no longer buy and sell shares of GameStop. Like, isn't that horrible that like, all this is going on? And so some people are saying, well, if it all on blockchain, like no one could turn it off. And I get that there's that sort of democratization, or that, oh, if we're all on Signal, then no one could read anything that's going on. But in a way, I sort of imagine whether, well, if that then leads to a world where, like, yeah, we can't turn something off. Like, in a way, you can complain about, like, oh, should Trump have been cut off from Twitter or not? And like, how should these unelected, the tech bras, like, have control over, over someone so prominent? On the other hand, imagine if like nobody had any control over that. Like, I'm not necessarily sure that that's that much better. You suddenly sort of built this machine where you literally, you can see horrible things, this train wreck coming, but there's literally no off switch. I don't know whether, you're better off sort of navigating the currents of a gray area in terms of, good and bad versus like simply not having any controls at all. So we're definitely careening down a track, and not sure where it's going, but like, boy, like I hope I stick around for a long time to read the conclusion, because like it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, we as we end this, because we got to wrap up here. One of the constant themes that we have here with Hunting for Silver Linings is that, clearly this lurching of the planet this last year has been filled with tragedy for a lot of people. But then there's folks like the three of us sitting here who are also at the same time pretty excited to see how things are going to be emerging, right? So.
Yep. No, it's a fascinating time, right? Like may like the old Chinese curse, may we live in interesting times. Well, we've certainly got that one. So we've gone pretty far adrift from talking about communications to startups, but it's a fascinating one, and we're all in the same boat at the end of the day. So it's an incredible time to be alive.
Well, I know that we really appreciate the generosity of your time today and for joining us. Looking forward to connecting with you again in the future and seeing.
Oh, we'll do that, absolutely. Are you kidding me? We have a tech guru here that covers communications. Of course, we'll have Otto again. Thank you, Otto.
Love it. You guys are awesome. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good rest of your day, my friend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Otto.
Bye-bye.